They don't want a rerun of the wars that have occurred. They're settled in, and they know that the Seventh Coalition is going to give Europe peace.
He's getting old, isn't he? You know, and kind of let it change its spots. I mean, I think the problem is that he's broken agreements in the past. He's either broken the spirit of them or he's broken them in letter. So, I mean, why would you trust anything you sign?
If the British and the Prussians are knocked out of this, and Napoleon has to be dealt with by the Austro-Hungarians and the Russians, this continent gets shaped by the Austrians and by the Russians, not by the British and the Prussians. And that has real implications for the subsequent peace negotiations, but also the shape of particularly this area here.
It's June 1815, and in the fields of Waterloo in what is now modern-day Belgium, one man's ambition and determination to dominate Europe is about to finally be brought to its knees. Napoleon Bonaparte had already achieved a monumental comeback, escaping from exile to return to Paris as Emperor of France, and now he had his sights set again on ruling the continent. But standing in his way was a coalition of forces led by his great adversaries, the Duke of Wellington and Marshal Blucher, with the aim to stop him in his tracks. The result? A decisive victory for the coalition, one which ended the Napoleonic Wars and shaped the future of Europe forever. I'm James Hanson, and welcome to History Undone, the show where we look at how the briefest of moments can shape our world. Every week we focus on a different battle or military campaign, and with the help of our experts we ask whether split-second decisions could have changed the outcome and history itself. Today it's the Battle of Waterloo, the final moment that saw Napoleon's dream shattered and the map of Europe redrawn. Yet what if the French army had won that day? Was it even possible? And if so, what might it have looked like? Those are questions for our experts, and joining me, as ever, is the historian and author, Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry. For the first time on the channel, we're delighted to be joined by Dr. Michael Rowe, reader in European history at King's College London. Welcome to you both. Now, in front of us, we have a big map of Western Europe as it would have been at the time. And of course, it's worth saying that the events of the Waterloo campaign in the summer of 1815, this follows the fall of Napoleon and him being forced to abdicate in 1814, the triumph of the Sixth Coalition, as it were. Then he's sent into exile on the Mediterranean island of Elba, just to the south of this map. But he escapes exile. And Dr. Chris Parry, to start with you, do you want to bring us up to speed of what happens between his escape from Elba and the events of Waterloo?
So Napoleon lands in the south of France and commences basically a march towards Paris. And on the way, he picks up elements of troops that were loyal to him in the past. Some of his former generals come and join him, including Marshal Ney. And he heads for Paris, and all the time he's trying to mobilise. He's trying to say to people, look, I'm back, we can do this again. And what we're going to have to do, though, is deal with the armies that are now mobilising against us. And what you have is you have a Prussian army under Marshal Blucher up here in the Netherlands with the Duke of Wellington with essentially what is an EU army. It comprises Brits, it comprises Germans of all sorts, and also Dutch as well. And they are basically in the vicinity of Brussels. Meanwhile, the Russians are mobilising, coming a long way, of course, from here, and the Austrians are massing here on the Rhine itself, and quite a lot of troops as well, they're mobilising. It's worth bearing in mind that the Portuguese and Spanish, recently liberated, of course, they're mobilising, and there are armies, Austro-Hungarian armies in Italy that are also massing to take on Napoleon again. So he's operating on internal lines. He's trying to recruit, he's trying to supply armies, and he manages to get together quite a considerable army of about 100,000. But overall, he's only got about 225,000 in June 1815 against what is potentially 800,000. So the Seventh Coalition is looking to stop this in its tracks. There's no question about that.
Michael, welcome to History Undone. Great to have you on the channel. If you are Napoleon at this point, do you have to really think about launching some kind of preemptive strike against the Seventh Coalition? Is it not an option to go, you know what, I'm going to sit in Paris and consolidate my power?
That is not a good choice. No, you need to do a preemptive strike. And you are looking at potentially a multi-front, a multi-theatre war. And the obvious place to go is the Netherlands. So up here, drive a wedge between the Prussians and the British coalition army. Probably in terms of order of importance, the next important front will be here, where you're dealing with the Austrians, Schwarzenberg, over 200,000. That's going to be a very important theatre if you've dealt with that one first. And then probably the next important one is here, Italy, and then you've got the Pyrenees. I would add that Napoleon's power in France is not secure. You know, his home base is fragile. There are a lot of French people that don't support him. And yes, some marshals like Ney, they rally to Napoleon, but others don't, and he'll sorely miss them.
And Chris, talk to us about what Napoleon has at his disposal at this point. I mean, when you compare it to the strength of the Seventh Coalition, how is he faring?
Yes, now one of the things he's hoping for is that he can detach the people of the Netherlands, what is now Belgium and the Netherlands, from their allegiance to the Seventh Coalition as well. The other thing he's facing is a royalist rebellion in Brittany at the time. So he's committed 20,000 troops to that. So what he's managed to do is mobilise probably 100,000, 120,000. His supply lines are not great. So the army that he puts together to go to the north, and he calls it the Army of the North, takes just about enough ammunition and supplies to actually fight in the Netherlands. He's going to have to come back, resupply before he faces the Austrians. So what he's hoping is he can detach two members of the coalition, then regroup, and actually, of course, success breeds success. If people in France can see he's back to his old ways again and winning battles and things like that, then people will rally to him. And quite a lot of the people, I think, who are basically sitting on the fence. I mean, quite a lot of his senior officers are staying on their estates, which they've won, during the previous 20 years, and don't really want to hazard those things that they've won. I mean, one of his best generals, his best corps commander, Marmont, he refuses to join Napoleon. He's got a problem on his hands in actually, as Michael says, getting the people of France on his side.
And then, Michael, before we get to the Battle of Waterloo, we should say there are two other key battles, Ligny and then Quatre-Bras. Do you want to tell us a little bit about those? Yes,
well, these are two battles which happen on the same day, on the 16th of June, so 2 days before the Battle of Waterloo. And one of them is a Wellington win, that's Quatre-Bras, where Wellington holds up Marshal Ney. And the other is a Napoleon win, and that's Ligny, where Napoleon defeats a Prussian army. And, if we're going to kind of do counterfactual speculation, I would say the campaign isn't really winnable for Napoleon on the 18th, but I think it is winnable on the 16th. There are things which go seriously wrong on the French side on the 16th, not least of which is the famous case of d'Erlon's corps, which is not engaged in either of those battles. And had it been there at Ligny, I think there's a good chance that the Prussians would have suffered not only a defeat, but a very serious defeat. The trick is not only defeating your enemy from Napoleon's perspective, but pushing them apart, making sure that they don't retreat in such a way that they remain in contact with each other. You need to get the Prussians to retreat eastwards towards Namur or Liège and to the Rhine, and to push them out, and that would then leave Wellington isolated. Now, if Ligny had gone to plan, there wouldn't be a Battle of Waterloo. Wellington only stands his ground at Waterloo in the expectation that the Prussians are still in the game. So I suppose my argument would be it's not so much Napoleon winning the Battle of Waterloo as winning the Waterloo campaign, which we probably should then call the Ligny campaign on the 16th. No Battle of Waterloo is necessary then.
That's a really interesting point. Chris, what's your take on that?
Well, absolutely. I mean, the astonishing thing is that in the presence of the enemy, Napoleon actually splits his forces. Wellington is coming in to reinforce Blucher when he's at Quatre-Bras. And as Michael says, Ney goes in with actually probably the best of Napoleon's corps. And Napoleon takes Grouchy and another marshal with the 6th Corps under a general called Lobau. He manages to kill 20,000 Prussians, but that's only a sixth of his force. one of the corps then splits off from the main Prussian force, and Napoleon says to Grouchy, with 32,000 men, you keep the sword in his back, because he thinks that's the main Prussian force. In the meantime, Wellington, who has held at Quatre Bras against Ney, says, look, I'm going to fight him. I know where I'm going to fight him, but this absolutely depends on you, Blucher, coming to help me. I'm not doing this unless you come. And Gneisenau, who is basically Blucher's second in command. Now, what we have to bear in mind is that Blucher is trapped under his horse and is nearly captured at Ligny, is saved by his adjutant. And Gneisenau takes charge temporarily. And Gneisenau says, look, you know, we're going to be shortchanged here. Wellington's going to flee to the coast. He's an aristocrat. And Gneisenau comes from a very humble background as well. And Blucher says, no, you know, I've given my word. We are going to support Wellington. And the whole Battle of Waterloo depends on the promise of Blucher coming to reinforce Wellington. It doesn't happen without that promise, and Wellington very much relies on Blucher to come.
That is fascinating. So there is, I suppose, a counterfaction in which Blucher dies at Ligny, and then that could look very different for the entire Waterloo campaign.
And Gneisenau takes his whole forces to the east. And we have to remember, before the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807, quite a lot of these states here were Prussian. They were taken away from Prussia after the Treaty of Tilsit. So they're in friendly country, if you like, where they can resupply and regroup. The critical thing is that Napoleon thinks it's going to take them about 2 days to recover. So he's going to go and deal with Wellington.
Yeah.
Prussians aren't a problem. He's used to beating the Prussians anyway over the last 20 years. So he doesn't take them seriously. And he thinks Wellington's a sepoy general. That's what he calls them. You know, he's only fought in India, disregarding the fact he's beaten all his best generals in Spain and things like that. Yeah.
This is fascinating. We're almost into the counterfactuals already. Let's zoom in now and let's focus on the Battle of Waterloo itself. OK, we're going to talk about the battle itself in just a second, but before we do, let's just run through some of the key statistics. The 7th Coalition had around 116,000 total troops, made up of 68,000 Anglo-Allied forces and 48,000 Prussians. They had 156 guns available and suffered around 23,000 total casualties. Napoleon, meanwhile, had only around 72,000 troops at Waterloo itself, after he sent an additional 30,000 to follow the Prussians after Ligny. The French army had 246 guns available, and they suffered nearly 40,000 total casualties, including those killed, wounded or captured, and they lost 220 of their guns. Now, we have in front of us now a new map of the battlefield of Waterloo itself, or just south of Waterloo, in, of course, what is now modern-day Belgium, what was then the Netherlands. Dr. Chris Parry, to start with you, do you want to tell us about how the Duke of Wellington is lining up his forces here? Because he's taken the high ground of the Mont Saint-Jean Ridge.
Yep, and history says, I've never found the source of it, that he reconnoitred this beforehand and actually had this absolutely where he wanted to fight Napoleon. The critical thing that we need to notice here is a considerable slope. There's about 1 kilometre between these two forces here. But what we're looking at, though, are 3 fortified elements. There's a chateau here, which the British have fortified. There's a farmhouse complex called La Haye Sainte here, and this papillote here, and you can see the red lines that signify that. Why is that important? Because if anybody comes between here, you can enfilade fire them as they come past and really get some considerable attrition on the forces as they're climbing this slope. So that's quite important. He's got his guns actually sort of compressed within the main force here. Most importantly, he's only showing Napoleon his lead elements of his regiments. The rest are behind the line of the ridge. So Napoleon can't actually see how many forces are there. They're on the reverse slope, and he keeps them there lying down just in case the artillery actually fire, which they will do during the battle. The other important thing to notice is that Wellington has 17,000 troops about 6 miles to the west at a place called Halle under Prince Frederick of Orange. And they're there basically in case his very weak, what he considers to be his weak right flank is turned. And Marshal Soult, the Chief of Staff to Napoleon, says that's what we need to do.
Yeah.
We don't need to do a frontal assault here. We'll roll up this line. But Wellington's thought about that. So he's got these 17,000 troops ready to intervene from the west in case that happens. So he's thought about it. Now, he is absolutely relying on Blucher turning up. He doesn't know when he's going to turn up. So he gets up at 3 a.m. He's walking around his troops at 6, saying, look, this is where we need to be. And he intersperses British troops and German troops with the Dutch troops, because he doesn't totally trust the Dutch. They're not proven in battle, so they're interspersed. But he's expecting the Prussians at some stage during the day to come down this road here and through the woods here. If they don't come, he reckons he can't hold out against quite a significant preponderance of artillery. Napoleon has 90 more guns than Wellington does, and also some pretty experienced troops. Now, on the French side, what we have to bear in mind is he hasn't conscripted Napoleon for this. These are all seasoned troops, but every unit has different officers to the ones they're used to. He's put them together very quickly, and so quite a lot of the formation and unit commanders are not the ones who've served with the troops that they've got.
And he does have, Chris, the Imperial Guard.
He does have the Imperial Guard. They've never been in a losing battle. Everybody knows that, and he holds them in reserve.
So, Michael, is this the right way to set up? If you're Napoleon, was this the right approach?
Yes, it is. I mean, Napoleon, of course, is an artillery general. We've heard about the preponderance of guns. But what Napoleon really needs to think about is not simply dislodging the British, but dislodging in a certain way. And what he does not want to do is to push Wellington towards the Prussians. He doesn't want to push them towards the east. He wants to pivot them around this way. And the way you do that, of course, is to focus on Wellington's sort of centre-left. But you don't want to, of course, make that obvious. You need to get Wellington to weaken that centre-left part of his line. And the way you do that, of course, is to actually launch an attack here on Napoleon's right. So this is the corps of Rowe in front of Hougomont. And so that ideally is going to be a feint, which will then get Wellington to draw his reserves to defend Hougomont. And then once that part of the British front sector has been weakened, then you can think about moving d'Erlon forward. Of course, d'Erlon's infamous movements on the 16th we'd refer to earlier. And the idea is that you don't sort of push British troops towards Prussians, but you push the British towards the sea, and hence out of the campaign.
I mean, an interesting point is that Wellington briefs beforehand, if this goes wrong for us, we're going to retreat through the Swan Forest. And he actually explains very clearly what he's going to do. He's not going to go towards the Prussians. He's going to go that way.
And why would he do that?
Because once you get in the forest, you break up formations and you can actually get through pretty quickly, whereas anybody pursuing you, particularly cavalry, can't get through that easily. So he's already said, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go up to the north, back towards Brussels.
Now, Michael, the battle itself doesn't really begin until about 11 o'clock in the morning. Why so late?
Well, the weather has been very bad. I think we should also actually comment on the fact that the 18th of June is about the longest day of the year. So he has got perhaps a little bit more time than we think. So the battle actually starts at about 11. So I think there are a couple of explanations. I think the obvious one is that the ground is sodden, and it needs sunlight to dry out. And the sun does rise on the, there is a sunny day ahead on the 18th of June. And sodden ground means that, first of all, artillery can't be deployed, or not so easily. And there's also actually an indirect effect then of sodden ground sort of soaking up the shot, as opposed to allowing for that ricochet effect, which creates casualties. But there's also, I think, another explanation, which is that simply the units generally aren't in position. So we can be, again, a what if. What if Napoleon had deployed earlier? Is that wise to sort of rush a deployment when you're confronting Wellington, who's a good defensive general, and then you end up sort of like drip-feeding units into a sort of meat grinder? Quatre-Bras had been a little bit like that. Or do you actually wait until you're ready? So I wouldn't be too critical of that 11 a.m. start.
I suppose the counter-argument would be, to kind of get into some of the what-ifs, is that, if you're Napoleon, you know that the danger is what if Blucher turns up. So you want to try and preempt that, don't you? You want to defeat Wellington before he can turn up?
Remember, he thinks he needs 2 days to recover. He's got no intelligence. And he's got Grouchy out looking for them and marking them. The Problem is, Grouchy's never had an independent command before. He's always been part of a major battle line. So essentially, he's rather like Jeb Stuart at Gettysburg. He's gone totally off the plot and is not available to his commander to actually use in the battle.
OK, so the battle begins around about 11 o'clock in the morning on the 18th of June, 1815. Chris, do you want to talk us through the early stages?
Yes, so as Michael said, the first thing that occurs is this feint towards Hougoumont. And the French commit 14,000 troops to this. And you've got the King's German Legion here. They hold out. That's reinforced by a Guards division at one stage. And for the whole of the battle, Reyer's corps is fixed on this. And so it totally distracts the French. It's rather like at Blenheim, if you remember. They got distracted by one of the villages that was being fortified. And because of that, it's not going exactly how Napoleon wants it. Now, what happens around midday is that there's a huge cannonade. The Grand Battery, as the French call it, opens up essentially to soften up the Allied line. Now remember, quite a lot of the troops are on the reverse slope, so they're not actually feeling a lot of the effects of that, but obviously the skirmishers and those here and our own and the Allied artillery are actually feeling the effects of that. And that's essentially a softening up process so that d'Erlon can then actually attack up here. Now, while the artillery exchange is taking place, the French detect the Prussians coming from the northeast. And they work out they've got about 3 hours before the first corps under Ziethen arrives down this road here. So they've got to get on with it. So they're still locked in here at Hougoumont. So a major attack is launched by d'Erlon's corps here. And it's really sort of thrown out by Picton. They're not able to penetrate into La Haye-Sainte. Again, you know, the German Legion is holding that quite significantly. And while this is going on, Lord Uxbridge, who's in charge of the heavy cavalry, decides that he's going to charge down and attack d'Erlon's corps in the flank. And initially, they do absolutely brilliantly. They smash into about 4 divisions of d'Erlon's troops, catch them in the flank, but unfortunately, they get carried away and they go beyond the front lines and they get totally decimated. Probably half their strength destroyed by French cuirassiers who are held in reserve at this point. So you've got quite a serious problem with the cavalry. They have to retire. So at this point, another artillery exchange takes place. And Marshal Ney thinks he sees that the British are retiring from the ridge. In fact, they're taking their wounded back. So he puts together a cavalry force of about 5,000 and he attacks uphill here, only to find at the top that the British have got themselves into squares. And cavalry hate squares because they can't penetrate the nest of bayonets. What they've also done is overrun the British guns on this side. What they failed to do, though, is spike the guns. And so when this attack fails, the British are able to regain their guns and fire again at the French cavalry, which have already taken quite a hit on the way up. And of course, those horses are totally knackered by the time they get up here. There's 12 charges around these squares here, and they have to retire.
But Michael, should Napoleon not have had the foresight to realise that behind the tree line, the British would have reinforcements?
Yes, I think, you know, we spoke earlier about Napoleon underestimating Wellington as a sepoy general. So I think Ney, who's actually fought against against Wellington in Spain, is much more cautious. And again, I think one sees that actually at Quatre Pas. He knows about Wellington's use of the topography. Yes, he should have known that. And I think one thing which emerges from the discussion is actually the lack of battlefield control. I mean, I think Hougoumont in itself is not the objective. The objective is to get the British to redeploy troops from their centre. And I think where Wellington gets a huge amount of credit is in how he deploys his units, how he doesn't sort of overcompensate for a threat which he sees, for example, on his right by sort of throwing everything in there and seriously weakening his centre. He always seems to sort of spend the bare minimum which is required, which of course makes it hell for the people actually fighting at Hougomont and at La Haye-Sainte. But it's better for the greater good of the Anglo-Dutch army.
Chris, you want to come in on that?
I mean, he holds his nerve. Whereas Napoleon is actually quite fixed on this threat coming from the east, leaving Ney, who hasn't had a great sort of time at Leipzig and Jena. You know, he did a great retreat from Moscow, but he's not the sort of marshal you need to let loose on the battlefield if you really want your orders to be followed. And also, Wellington's about the field. He's actually going in and moving in and saying, look, we need to do something here. So much more active on this side. Whereas Napoleon, who may have been ill on the day, there's no question about that, but he's starting to get worried about the Prussians. He can see the Prussians emerging here from the woods, and the whole of Lobau's 6th Corps turns to face the Prussians here, so they can hold this village here. So at this stage of the battle, they're starting to look towards what they think is coming down the line. Well, they know is coming down the line. They've identified them. Meanwhile, Zuytern's 1st Corps from Blucher's army is coming down this road here to reinforce. And what happens then is that Ney decides that he's going to launch an attack up here against La Haye-Sainte and this part of the line. And in fact, it nearly penetrates the line, and at this point, La Haye-Sainte is captured. And what the French are able to do is bring their artillery up to La Haye-Sainte, a lot of their musketeers, and they start to break down the British centre and left here.
Because this is the weakest point of Wellington's line.
Absolutely, and Ney has got in there, and the artillery is inflicting huge damage on the British and Allied forces here. So what Wellington does is hold his nerve. Zuytern's 1st Corps comes in here and actually relieves the pressure on this, drives the French back. The British are able to consolidate. And the last throw of the dice, basically, is something that Ney wanted Napoleon to do, is actually reinforce his attack with the Imperial Guard. Napoleon delays for half an hour, I think, because he can see the other Prussian corps coming down here. So there's 1.5 Prussian corps coming down here under Blucher and Bülow. And so he's slightly distracted. Once this attack fails, the Prussian 1st Corps have come in to reinforce. He then commits the Imperial Guard up here. And of course, they have to face quite significant firepower, not only from Maitland's division, but also the 52nd Regiment, who are manoeuvring really well to impose firepower. And of course, all the guns that are able to play on them as they come up. And for the first time, the Imperial Guard is basically destroyed and has to retreat.
Michael, do you want to pick up the story?
Yes, and when the Imperial Guard breaks, that is a colossal morale loss for the French side. It's absolutely huge. One can't underestimate that. I think what I'd add about the Prussians is, of course, they do get a lot of credit, but they could have probably been on the battlefield earlier as well, in that the sequence of corps which they deploy is rather odd. The natural thing would have been to have actually moved the corps which is closest to Waterloo, as opposed to the one which is furthest, then overtaking all the others. So, the Prussians could have perhaps got there in the early afternoon. But Wellington, he holds his nerve. I think Napoleon has in the back of his mind the politics of this as well, that a defeat for Napoleon is actually worse than a defeat for anyone else, because his regime simply loses that legitimacy. I mean, for me, the obvious thing would have been for Napoleon not to actually fought the Battle of Waterloo at all on the 18th. But he can't withdraw.
Yeah.
He can't be seen to have withdrawn. And this is a problem, actually, that his nephew will face in 1870, in the war against the Prussians. Sometimes trading space for time does make sense.
And meanwhile, during the latter course of the day and into the evening and into the night, Grouchy is engaging with the remaining Prussian corps, which is a fairly indecisive action, but of course it's kept Grouchy well away. So that's 32,000 troops. And Tillerman's done his job in fixing Grouchy out here while the battle is going on.
And then, Chris, how does the battle conclude? You've got Blucher, who eventually arrives. He attacks Napoleon's right flank. And from that point on, it's not looking good for Napoleon.
Well, no, I think from the time the Imperial Guard were defeated, it wasn't looking good for Napoleon, and everybody accepts that. As Michael indicates, complete collapse in morale to see the Imperial Guard retreating. What Wellington does at this point sees that Blucher's 1.5 corps are here, and another one has joined him. This Ziethen's corps, first corps here. He orders a general advance down the ridge and completely clears the battlefield of the French, who either run away or are captured. And that's the end of it. Napoleon leaves in his coach.
And he's then forced to abdicate. I mean, he doesn't technically surrender, does he? I mean, the ABBA song is famously wrong, but he is forced to abdicate, Michael, because of it.
Yes, he does. And he abdicates, of course, in favour of his son, Napoleon II, who will never reign. And Grouchy, I think, actually tries to make a few efforts to get that recognised. But, politically, it's not going to work out. Grouchy, oddly, is the only French commander who's got any kind of coherent, intact force in his theatre of operations. But, that's not going to swing the balance back in Paris. The defeat really empowers all of those forces within Paris. A lot of French politicians have sat on the fence. They now move off the fence decisively to Louis XVIII, not least, for their own career prospects moving forward.
And just finally, on the battle itself, the long-term consequences it's the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon is then sent into his second exile on St. Helena. And I suppose, crucially, you then have a period of relative peace in Europe for almost 50 years.
Yes, you're talking about the Crimean War when you get the next large war. And of course, a large war in which Britain is involved in a continent, you're talking about a century, a large Napoleonic-style conflict where every European great power is involved. That's a century away. So I think that's one reason why Waterloo sticks in the imagination. It is the last of a very long sequence which had started in Valmy in 1792.
I mean, I think that the big issue that comes out of Waterloo is the rise of Prussia, because at the subsequent Congress of Vienna, it gets a huge acquisition of territory. So you get Westphalia, the Rhineland, you get Posen, as it's called in the east, and a major part of Saxony as well. So the rise of Prussia then starts inexorably through the 19th century. So you wonder if they'd been smashed at Ligny, they'd retired, and Waterloo had been lost, the rise of Prussia might not have been quite so linear, shall we say.
Well, there we go. That is the real history of what happened at the Battle of Waterloo. Now let's undo all of that. This is History Undone. Okay, well, let's start by asking ourselves, could Napoleon have won here? Michael, am I right in saying that your view is maybe not that he could have won at Waterloo itself, but if it hadn't got to Waterloo, had he had a decisive victory at Ligny, then it could have looked very different. He could have won the Waterloo campaign.
Yes, we wouldn't even be calling it the Waterloo campaign because there wouldn't have been a battle on the 18th. Yes, I think Napoleon's best chance is on the 16th. And I think it's all about d'Erlon's corps, not sort of bouncing backward and forward between the two battles of that day, but being committed. Well, I suppose the question is which one? Where would it have been more useful? I think it would have been much more useful at Ligny than at Quatre Bras. It would have simply been sort of fed into this sort of slightly beat grinder type of battle. Had it arrived at Ligny when it was supposed to arrive in the late afternoon, at the right place, it would have hit the Prussian right at the worst possible moment, at the moment when Napoleon was committing the Imperial Guard. And I think there you're looking at the shattering of two Prussian corps. You're looking at the annihilation of half their army, with maybe Blucher being bagged as a bonus, either as a prisoner or, he doesn't survive falling under his horse. And that means that the Prussians then have got a real problem. It's not entirely clear, I think, what Gneisenau is going to do. It might be that what Wellington called the most important decision of the 19th century, i.e. that decision to retreat but stay in contact with the British, wouldn't have been made. So the Prussians, one way or the other, are out of the game on the 16th. Now, without that promise from Blucher, Wellington isn't going to make his stand. Battle of Waterloo doesn't happen. Wellington pulls back. Now, the question is to where? To Ostend? To Antwerp? Does he try and sort of hole up in the fortress at Antwerp? Because, of course, what Napoleon needs to do is now start to worry about those other theatres we referred to at the beginning. So he hasn't got unlimited time to sort of, push the British back over the Channel or the North Sea. He's under a sort of timetable as well. So I think that's where we've got some interesting sort of counterfactuals, which are still related to actually this campaign. It wouldn't have ended, I guess, until the British have been dealt with one way or the other.
Chris, let's bring you in on that. I mean, an interesting point that Michael raises is what if Blucher dies on the 16th at Ligny? And this is an age-old historical debate about how important are individual figures, how important are the great men. And of course, you've got three great generals here. You've got Napoleon, you've got Wellington, you've got Blucher. So if he dies, what does that mean for the rest of the campaign?
There's a real debate about whether Gneisenau wanted to join Wellington or go east to Namur and get out of it. I think Michael's right. If you smash up two corps at Ligny, the Prussians aren't even in position to intervene after that because, they've got Grouchy there. I mean, Grouchy's got a powerful division. And let's not forget, Grouchy was a major part of winning at Ligny. He was the major corps commander. So that's it. I mean, my view is that if we actually see the battle for what it is, the real problem is that Napoleon hasn't brought his first 11 along in terms of his generals. He's left a marshal called Davout, who's a great corps commander, back as Minister of War and the military governor of Paris, basically keeping an eye on people who might rebel against Napoleon. He doesn't have his chief of staff, who had been with him from 1796 all the way through to 1814, Berthier. Absolutely brilliant administrator and logistician, hopeless commander in the field, but absolutely complemented Napoleon properly. Again, an outstanding corps commander, Marmont, refuses to join Napoleon. So he's not got the best marshals here. Ney, as I said earlier, has not had the best reputation in two recent battles at Jena and at Leipzig. And so he's got a bit of a problem in command and control here. And that is reflected, I think, in the piecemeal way in which the French attack. The Ney attack, for example, that takes place, this cavalry attack between Les Haye-Saintes and Hougoumont. I mean, it's only about 700 metres, this. And so you've got 5,000 cavalry unsupported by infantry and artillery. That's not how you do Napoleonic battles. And you have to say that throughout this battle, the sort of control and delegation that Napoleon is used to is not happening here. So it's all a bit piecemeal. There's no control. And partly it's because, as we've mentioned, he underestimates his opponents. He says in the morning, Wellington's a bad general. The British are bad troops. This affair is no more difficult than having breakfast.
Why would he think Wellington's a bad general?
Well, he may have been actually trying to raise the morale of his senior officers and staff.
It may just be trash talk.
Yeah. So it may have been that, but he actually fights the battle like that. That's the extraordinary thing. And it's not until his attention is turned by the arrival of the Prussians that he sees that things are getting quite serious. But let's give Wellington credit here. Wellington has said, I will fight this battle if the Prussians come. I'm going to hold my nerve. If they come, we win. Otherwise, we'll have nightfall, please.
Yes.
And we can escape. But, he's actually put in a plan that has actually sucked Napoleon in to actually fight this battle.
So, Michael, by the time you get to the 18th and Waterloo itself, is there anything really Napoleon could have done on the day to win this battle? I mean, what if it deployed the Imperial Guard earlier?
No, I just don't see it working. I mean, I suppose you think what is Wellington really worried about? And he does seem to be overly worried about his right and his extreme right flank, with forces actually where I'm standing here deployed, which could have been of use. So, and I suppose, one thing in war is you do not underestimate your opponent. Napoleon seems to do that. But you also perhaps try and play on some of your opponent's nightmares. And so I think concentrating on Hougoumont and on the right is in itself actually clever. I think where the command and control then breaks down is that all these troops here under Prince Jerome, the division, get kind of dragged into trying to take I'm not going to use a four-lettered word, but taking the farmhouse. That in itself is not the point of that. But yeah, I think deploying the Imperial Guard early, no, that's your strategic reserve. It's there for sort of contingencies. We haven't reached that point yet. You're simply going to blow it earlier on in the battle. Wellington's line hasn't been softened up by the artillery. What do you do with d'Erlon's corps, which is in the way? So No, I don't see that working. I think for me, had I woken up on the early 18th knowing that the Prussians weren't, what we now know of hindsight is, do you actually affect some kind of withdrawal? I mean, that's let's say a nuclear option, but can Napoleon pull back, get Grouchy to pull back, reconcentrate and start again, having lost 3 or 4 days in a campaign where time is not on his side?
Chris?
I think, and we've been hinting at it already, the fact that British were and the Allied forces were able to hang on to Hougoumont, La Haye Sainte, and Papillote as long as they did really slows the French down. There's no question about that. The amount of fire coming out of these places is, as I said, decimating their troops as they go forward. I think the only chance he had was when Ney attacks up here. If he'd committed the Imperial Guard there, he probably could have rolled up the left side here, but then he'd have had to turn around and face Zaitan's one corps coming in from the northeast. I think it was getting a bit desperate by this stage, to tell you the truth. They hadn't been able to penetrate where they thought they would. The first attack by D'Erlon, which is broken up by the heavy cavalry charge by Uxbridge, probably made Napoleon think, hang on, that didn't work. We've destroyed the heavy cavalry, but we're no further forward now. My own view on this, and I think Michael's absolutely right, Napoleon normally does a flanking and encirclement manoeuvre, and yet this is a frontal attack. This is totally un-Napoleonic. Now, he doesn't know about the 17,000 troops at Halle. There's no sort of skirmishes out that way. So what I don't understand is, if you don't want to go near Hougoumont, why you don't come round the side here and attack in the flank. You are splitting your forces slightly, and at that point Wellington could have advanced down here, but of course then you turn around into flank again. And look, he's got the bulk of his cavalry here as well, so they can manoeuvre quite fast. So I don't understand why a flanking manoeuvre wasn't possible here, to tell you the truth.
Michael, you do hear some people say Napoleon got unlucky with the weather. Is that a red herring?
Yes, I think it is. I mean, partly because we're actually looking at a very long day. And, Napoleon does this in the 1812 campaign, where he sort of blames it on, bad weather in Russia. Well, I mean, you do get bad weather in Russia. It's very hot summers and you might have factored that in. No, I don't think so. I think the big mistake is as I say, is 2 days earlier. I think what we might be looking at Waterloo on the 18th is something which is sort of semi-salvageable, something which is not a decisive defeat, a score draw. And I mean, in the Napoleonic period, you do have sort of indecisive battles. You have also battles which take place over several days, like the Battle of Leipzig. So maybe we're then looking at what happens on the 19th. With Wellington of somehow being pivoted around and combined with the Prussians, but that doesn't look great for
Grouchy returns.
Yeah.
I mean, that could happen. I mean, I think you're right, Michael. But Napoleon does need to get this over with. He's got other pressing concerns, like the Austro-Hungarians.
Only approaching. 250,000 of them.
Yeah. I mean, pretty significant. He's also not got the logistics to support this for very long. We've got to remember, he's put this together very quickly. He doesn't have the supply lines that he's had in the past. And let's face it, he doesn't have the commanders or indeed the troops he's had in the past. This is not the Grande Armée anymore. It's a Petite Armée, a very small proportion of what he used to have. So although the muscle and collective memory is good amongst many of the troops here, as I said earlier, the commanders are not used to working with these troops. So he's trying to hold them together as well.
Well, I'll tell you what, let's get into what we love doing here on History Undone and ask ourselves, had the Battle of Waterloo played out differently, what might the long-term historical consequences have been? Right, so now we have a new map of Europe in front of us, laid out as it was after the Congress of Vienna. I suppose, Chris, to start with you, the first thing we should ask is, does a French win at Waterloo fundamentally alter the geography of this map?
Not of itself, because there are a lot of other battles to be fought. We saw at the start that you've got 225,000 Austro-Hungarians basically pressing on the eastern borders of France. They have to be dealt with. 2 weeks later, you're going to get the Russian army arriving as well. So essentially, you're going to see the 7th Coalition, I think, squash this revival by Napoleon pretty quickly. He can't mobilise quickly enough. Too many people are sitting on the fence in France. They don't want a rerun of the wars that have occurred. They're settled in, and they know that the Seventh Coalition is going to give Europe peace.
Michael, is there any scenario, therefore, where Napoleon is able to consolidate power, re-establish some kind of Napoleonic empire, and remain in the picture beyond 1815?
I think it's only going to work politically. And by that I mean if the politics of the coalition don't work for the coalition, if one or more of the parties to that coalition decide to exit it. And there are some, hairline cracks, perhaps not more than that, which are going to be stress tested quite seriously if the Prussians, for example, are knocked out really seriously.
And the British.
And the British.
Yeah.
And I think it's partly how they are knocked out. If the Prussians feel that they've been betrayed by the British, or by the British by the Prussians, and you start to get this kind of poison entering into coalition politics, and you'd have this in the earlier coalitions against Napoleon, incidentally, where the partners sort of fall apart amongst themselves, then you've got possibly a very slim chance that you might start to fracture the coalition. And they have got a problem themselves. They've imposed Louis XVIII in 1814, and it hasn't worked. The nightmare scenario for the coalition is that it's not, a second restoration isn't going to work either. So what do? Are you going to have a permanent army of occupation in France? Are you going to have some kind of permanent military commitment, which none of the parties want, least of all the British? And I think in British politics, there is a faction within British politics which is going into a rather moralistic phase when it comes to foreign policy in 1815. And I think there's this idea that you do not impose regimes on peoples who are opposed to that particular regime. Does that provide Napoleon with something of an opening? Not for himself, maybe, but for his son, for the King of Rome, who, after all, is also a Prince of Habsburg. Can that be brought into play? So Bonapartist future, but one without Napoleon first.
Is the fundamental problem, Chris, that if you're Napoleon in 1815, you have got enemies on 4 fronts?
You've got enemies on 5 fronts if you include France itself.
Yes.
I mean, the real issue for France at this stage is la gloire, glory. And already Napoleon said, look, like Louis XIV, France, it's me. And quite a lot of the French ideas about itself, about themselves at this time, are wrapped up in the idea of the empire and Napoleon himself. So that's going for him. The thing that I think would be a counterfactual here is if the British and the Prussians are knocked out of this, and Napoleon has to be dealt with by the Austro-Hungarians and the Russians, this continent gets shaped by the Austrians and by the Russians, not by the British and the Prussians. And that has real implications for the subsequent peace negotiations, but also the shape of particularly this area here. So does Prussia get such a huge say in what happens in terms of land division? Does it lose the territories it got at the Congress of Vienna? Because previously, the whole eastern part of Prussia had to go to Russia as a result of the Treaty of Tilsit. So it seems to me that if Waterloo doesn't happen, you have a fundamentally different character shaped by Austria and Russia, as opposed to Britain necessarily and Prussia itself.
That's really interesting.
And the rise of Germany looks, I think, a bit different.
Michael, do you want to come in on that?
Yes, I think the balance possibly between Austria and Prussia changes, and that does have really long-term implications. What I would say, mind you, is that the Austrians are fairly conservative when it comes to the sort of 1815 settlement. So my feeling is that they would have tried to stick by it, just as the British did. What the Austrians don't want is a massive increase in Russian power. They want to keep France in the game. I think another interesting thing we need to perhaps speculate about is what happens if a lot of the fighting takes place in France itself. How do the French people respond to that? Do they drift away from Napoleon even further, or do you get some kind of nation in arms mentality coming into being? And
so during the Revolution.
Yes, or even like 1870-71, after the Battle of Sedan, where you get a sort of a war of national defence, something which Napoleon can put himself at ahead of. I don't think it's going to happen. I think the French are still war weary. I think ultimately we're looking at a repeat performance of 1814, dragging into early 1816, into the summer of 1816. The year, of course, without a summer, as they call it. So do we need to factor in volcanism in this? It's a pretty rotten year, 1816. If Napoleon can spin things out, does the rest of Europe become so war-weary and poor and impoverished by harvest failures that they say, OK, you can have a Bonaparte in Paris, we're going to go home.
Well, of course, you get a Napoleon later. I mean, Louis Napoleon III. There is a residual sentiment for Napoleon and his legacy. And as I said, it's bound up with how the French feel about themselves. These are the glory days. We conquered most of Europe. That's how we feel about ourselves. It's rather like Russia today. It's been a great power. It resents not being a great power again. So the French are always trying to get back to that, if you like, centre point of when they had an empire.
And Michael, if Napoleon had somehow won at Waterloo or won the campaign with a decisive victory at Ligny, presumably you do not therefore get the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy.
Well, it depends how that war of the Seventh Coalition, which drags into possibly 1816, plays out. There are alternatives. Whether they're plausible or not is partly subjective, but alternatives have been floated in 1814, and one alternative is the Crown Prince of Sweden, still at this point, Bernadotte. Of course, the Bernadottes are still in Stockholm, so maybe we'd have a Bernadotte in Paris to this day. You might go for a Napoleon II sort of regency. I mean, he's about 3 at this point. He's born in 1811, with presumably his mother, Marie-Louise, Empress Regent.
And the Austrians would find that very acceptable.
Possibly, yeah. I mean, they might be there to offer some free advice. And you'd have people like Talleyrand and Fouché on some kind of regency council. That might have spared France, a great deal of problem, because they would have got to 1848 without those sort of intervening regime changes. So you've straight gone on to a kind of second empire without any. Well, it would have still been the first empire in effect.
I mean, I think the key question is if Waterloo is won by Napoleon, what is his capacity to turn on the Austrians and defeat the Austrians? If he can get the nation behind him and we get another Battle of Valmy, as you say, Michael, a nation in arms saying, look, the Austrians are on our borders, let's deal with that. That's the critical battle afterwards. If he can defeat the Austrians, possibly on the soil of France, send them back to the east, the Russians might not come.
And then he could strike a political solution, and he could say, allow me to keep my regime in France, and he can preserve his grip on power, in France at least.
Yeah, but if you read the literature of the times, people don't like Napoleon unless you're French. They really don't like him. Personally, I mean, there's a bit of it. They look down on him. That's the first thing. From his origins and things like that. He's pretentious. He's done all of this. He's successful. We don't like him very much. And he has been a great thief, as they called him at the time, throughout Europe. And the Prussians hate Napoleon and the French because of what has happened to their country. So I just wonder whether that would have been tolerable. And of course, he broke out of jail. We don't like that very much.
Yes, quite.
Which is why they put him on St. Helena.
So in a way, are we almost saying, Michael, that as long as Napoleon is at large, as it were, there are going to be Napoleonic wars?
He's getting old, isn't he? And kind of leopard change its spots. I mean, I think the problem is that he's broken agreements in the past. He's either broken the spirit of them or he's broken them in letter. So, I mean, why would you trust anything you sign? I mean, I might sort of throw in something, which is to say that in certain ways, Napoleon is actually the winner of 100 Days. It really does feed into this Napoleonic legend. Had the 100 Days not happened, he would have eked out his sort of the rest of his life like in a sort of retirement home in the Mediterranean, of the island of Elba. And it's very pleasant for him. Well, except it wouldn't have been. Exactly. But he gets martyred, in effect, in 1815. He's Prometheus. He's put onto this sort of rock in the South Atlantic. And he can play the victim. And also during the 100 Days, he does liberalise France. He abolishes the slave trade, partly to try and undermine British opinion, and he introduces a more liberal constitution. So the 100 Days episode is really important for creating this kind of progressive Napoleonic legend. And of course, it's his nephew, he who turns into Napoleon III, that benefits in the presidential elections in France of December 1848 and institutes the Second Empire. So I think without 100 days, no Second Empire.
And Chris, I wonder about what the long-term consequences may have been for Britain had it suffered a defeat at Waterloo. I mean, the Duke of Wellington's historical reputation would be very different. He, of course, went on to have 2 terms as Prime Minister. And I wonder, is there any knock-on impact on the British Empire even?
No, the British say, look, we're so strong at sea. We're fed up with continental commitments. Having said that, we've got a lot of residual commitments to Hanover, of course, from the Georgian times. The Baltic's quite important to us for naval supplies and things like that. So we're going to want to remain engaged. We'll want proxies on the continent. So I suspect Prussia will be a close proxy. Now, if you're cooperating with Prussia in the early part of the century, how does your relationship with Germany roll out towards the end of the century?
Yes.
So you might have a difference there. But I think Britain will just say, fine, we're strong at sea. We've strangled the continental system in the past. We've got all our colonies. We've got the world's trade. We've got the physical equivalent, the World Wide Web, the sea at our disposal. And we'll just carry on that way.
Gentlemen, as ever, this has been absolutely fascinating. Thank you both so much. I think what we've learned is that maybe not at Waterloo itself, but potentially Napoleon could have won what became known as the Waterloo campaign had he struck a more decisive victory at Ligny on the 16th of June in 1815. Had, for instance, Marshal Blucher been killed in that battle, potentially you don't get the Prussians coming to Wellington's aid in the Battle of Waterloo on the 18th. And so potentially there is a scenario in which Napoleon is able to preserve his regime in some way, shape or form, probably through some kind of political settlement. Certainly if he were able to then take the fight to the Austrians, certainly if he were able to drag out the Napoleonic Wars into 1816. Realistically, he was always up against it after the 100 days. But had that happened, what might Europe look like now? Certainly Central Europe could look very, very different because you don't get the rise of Prussia as the great power it became towards the end of the 19th century. Austria potentially far stronger. And do you get what we know now as modern-day Germany and the Germany that rose up in the beginning part of the 20th century if Prussia emerges from the Napoleonic Wars in a very different way? Some really fascinating long-term consequences, all stemming from the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. My thanks to Dr. Michael Rowe and Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry for joining me. And we will be back undoing more battles from history very soon. But in the meantime, remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel, History Undone, on YouTube. And don't forget, you can also listen to the show wherever you get your podcasts. And we'll see you next time. Goodbye.